Lucas had always been a natural on the field. At 18, he was already a rising star in his town, known for his speed, his sharp footwork, and his ability to read the game in ways that few his age could. Coaches talked about him like he was the next big thing, and scouts from major clubs were already eyeing him for a professional contract. He had everything lined up: talent, drive, and a future full of promise. But there was one person Lucas wanted to impress more than anyone: his grandmother, Donna Lourdes. She'd raised him since he was a kid, ever since his parents had passed away. They didn't have much, but she made sure Lucas had everything he needed to pursue his dreams. She was always in the stands, watching every match, whether it was in the local field or at a youth tournament across town. She'd clap the loudest when Lucas scored and cheer him on even when the team was losing. For Lucas, it wasn't just about being the best player on the field. It was about making her proud. She'd sacrifice so much to support him, working extra hours at the bakery, skipping her own needs to make sure he had the right cleats or money for bus fare to practices. He owed her everything, and he knew it. "You'll lift that trophy one day, Mufilo," she'd say, her voice warm and full of hope. "I know it. I'll be right there to see it." That thought kept Lucas going, even when things got tough. His grandmother wasn't just his caretaker. She was his rock, his biggest fan, and his constant source of motivation. The dream of lifting a trophy wasn't just his, it was theirs. Every time he stepped onto the field, it wasn't just for him, it was for her. The day he got the call to join the senior team's training squad, Lucas couldn't wait to tell Donna Lourdes. She'd been feeling a bit under the weather, nothing serious, but she hadn't been to his last few games. Still, Lucas rushed home, bursting through the door with his soccer bag slung over his shoulder, barely containing his excitement. "Vo," he called, his voice echoing through their small apartment. Guess what? She was sitting at the kitchen table, her knitting in her hands. The smile that spread across her face as soon as she saw him made everything worth it. "Tell me, Lucas," she said, setting the yarn aside. "What happened?" "I made it," he grinned. "I'm on the senior team now. They want me to start training with them next week." Her eyes filled with pride, and she reached out to hold his hand. "I knew it," she whispered. "I always knew it." Lucas could feel his chest swell with happiness. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment she had been waiting for. Everything was finally falling into place. That weekend, they decided to take a short trip out of town, just the two of them. It was something they did every now and then, a tradition to celebrate his victories. It wasn't anything fancy, just a drive to the countryside to get away from the noise and the stress for a few hours. For Lucas, it was the perfect way to unwind before starting what was going to be the most important chapter of his career. The drive was peaceful, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the hills as they drove down the winding roads. Donna Lourdes had the window rolled down, her hand out in the breeze, humming a tune softly as she did. Lucas was at the wheel, relaxed, thinking about the future, about all the possibilities ahead. The senior team, his debut, the dream he'd shared with his grandmother for so long. But life, as it often does, had other plans. In a matter of seconds, everything changed. Lucas didn't even see it coming. The car speeding from the opposite direction, crossing into their lane without warning. He barely had time to react. Tires screeched, metal crunched, and everything went dark. Lucas woke up to the sterile smell of disinfectant and the rhythmic beeping of machines. His head throbbed and his vision was blurry as he tried to make sense of where he was. The last thing he remembered was the drive, the sun, the open road, his grandmother humming beside him. But now, as his eyes adjusted to the dim hospital room, it all came crashing back. The accident. Panic surged through him as he instinctively tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. His legs felt heavy, numb even. He tried to sit up, but pain shot through his torso, forcing him to stop. It was then that the reality of his situation began to sink in. "Lucas?" A soft voice called from beside him. He turned his head slowly to see a nurse standing by his bed. her face a mix of sympathy and concern. "You've been in an accident," she said gently. "You've been unconscious for 2 days." Lucas's mind raced. 2 days? What happened? His grandmother. He opened his mouth to ask about her, but his throat felt raw and no words came out. The nurse seemed to understand. "Your grandmother is alive," she assured him, "but she's in critical condition. She's being taken care of in the ICU." Relief washed over him for a brief moment, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing fear. He wanted to see her, to know she was okay. But before he could focus too much on that, the nurse continued. "Lucas," she said slowly, her voice steady but serious, "there's something else you need to know." His heart pounded in his chest as she explained that during the accident, he had suffered a severe spinal injury. The doctors had done everything they could, but for now, he had lost all feeling and movement in his legs. There was a possibility of recovery with extensive rehabilitation, but the road ahead would be long and uncertain. Lucas felt like the ground had just fallen out from under him. No feeling in his legs? His mind went blank. He didn't know how to process the words. The first thing that came to his mind was football, his career, his dream, everything he had worked for. How could he play without his legs? How could he live without football? The room felt like it was closing in on him. He wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything, but all he could do was lie there, helpless and in shock. He couldn't lose football. He couldn't lose everything. Over the next few days, Lucas barely spoke. Doctors and nurses came in and out, explaining his condition, giving him options for physical therapy, but none of it registered. All he could think about was the field, the way it felt to run, to dribble, to score, and now that part of him was gone. It was like a piece of his soul had been ripped away. The only thing that kept him from spiraling further into despair was the thought of his grandmother. She was still in critical condition, and he hadn't been allowed to see her yet. Every time a nurse came in, he would ask how she was doing, but the answers were always vague, carefully worded to avoid giving him too much hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lucas was wheeled into the ICU to see her. The sight of Donna Lourdes hooked up to all those machines broke him. She looked so small, so fragile, a far cry from the vibrant woman who had always been his pillar of strength. "Va," he whispered, his voice cracking. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. Despite her condition, a faint smile spread across her face when she saw him. "Lucas!" she rasped, her voice barely audible. He could see the pain in her eyes, but there was something else there too. A quiet strength, the same strength she had always shown him. He wanted to tell her everything, how sorry he was, how scared he was, but he didn't know where to begin. Before he could find the words, she spoke again, her voice weak but determined. "Don't give up, mio figlio," she whispered. "You have to keep going, for me, for yourself." Lucas's heart clenched. He wanted to believe her, but how could he? His legs didn't work, his career was over, and she didn't have much time left. He could see it in her eyes. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've lost everything." "No," she said firmly, her voice stronger than before. "You haven't lost everything. You still have your heart, your spirit, and that's what's going to get you through this." Tears welled up in Lucas's eyes. He didn't know how to respond. He had always relied on her strength, but now she was asking him to be strong. How could he, when everything seemed so broken? "I want to see you lift that trophy," she said softly, her eyes locking onto his. "Promise me, Lucas. Promise me you'll find a way." His throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. How could he make that promise when he didn't even know if he'd ever walk again, let alone play football? But as he looked into her eyes, he knew he couldn't let her down. She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. "I promise, Vo," he whispered, choking back the tears. "I'll find a way." A weak smile crossed her face, and she closed her eyes, resting again. Lucas stayed by her side for as long as the nurses would let him, holding her hand, replaying their conversation over and over in his mind. He didn't know how he was going to keep that promise, but for her, he knew he had to try. The days after that visit to the ICU were a blur for Lucas. He spent most of his time staring at the ceiling of his hospital room, his mind circling around the same thought, the promise he had made to his grandmother. "I'll find a way," he'd said. But how? He couldn't walk. His legs were useless. How was he supposed to find his way back to the field, let alone lift a trophy? Whenever his thoughts became too much, he'd ask the nurses for updates on his grandmother. Each time, their responses were gentle but cautious. "She's holding on, but..." There was always a but. Lucas hated that word. It hung in the air like a dark cloud, reminding him of how fragile everything had become. Then, one evening, just as the sun was setting outside his window, a nurse entered his room. Her expression was different this time. She wasn't just being cautious, she was bracing him for something. "Lucas," she began softly, pulling up a chair next to his bed. "Your grandmother, she doesn't have much time left. The doctors are saying it could be any day now." The words hit him like a freight train. Even though he knew this moment was coming, hearing it out loud made it real in a way he hadn't been prepared for. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Can I see her?" His voice was small, almost childlike, as if he were afraid of the answer. The nurse nodded, and within minutes, Lucas was wheeled back into the ICU, where his grandmother lay. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines. She looked even more fragile than before, her face pale, her breathing shallow. "Vo," Lucas whispered as he reached out and gently took her hand. Her eyes fluttered open, and despite the pain and exhaustion etched into her features, she managed to smile. "You're here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'm here, Vo." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Lucas didn't know how to say what he was feeling. How do you say goodbye to the person who raised you, who believed in you when no one else did? How do you let go of the person who has been your whole world? But it was Donna Lourdes who spoke first. "Remember what you promised me," she whispered, her fingers squeezing his hand weakly. Lucas nodded, though the doubt still gnawed at him. "I promised," he said, his voice cracking. "But I don't know if I can do it, Vo. My legs, I don't know if I'll ever be able to play again." Her eyes, though dim with exhaustion, still held that same unwavering belief. "You'll find a way, meu filho," she said, her voice growing fainter. "You've always found a way." Lucas blinked back the tears that were threatening to spill over. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to have that same strength she had always shown him, but right now all he could feel was fear. Fear of losing her, fear of failing her. She took a shallow breath, her chest rising slowly. "Just promise me again," she said softly. "Promise me you won't give up." Lucas swallowed hard and squeezed her hand tightly. "I promise, Vo. I won't give up. I'll find a way." A faint smile crossed her lips, and she closed her eyes again, her hand still resting in his. The room felt heavy, as if the very air was thick with the weight of their final moments together. Lucas sat with her for as long as they would let him, holding her hand, feeling the slow rhythm of her breaths. He didn't say much after that. What was there left to say? All he could do was sit there, in the quiet, and hold on to the promise he'd made. It was just after midnight when the nurse came back into the room. She looked at Lucas with soft eyes, and he knew. The machines had gone quiet. His grandmother's breathing had slowed to a stop. She was gone. The grief hit him like a tidal wave, but at the same time, there was an odd sense of peace. He had been there with her until the very end. He had held her hand, and he had promised. And now he had to keep that promise. The next few days passed in a daze. There was a small funeral, attended by a few close friends and neighbors. Lucas barely registered any of it. His mind was still locked in that hospital room, replaying her words over and over again. "Promise me you won't give up." That promise hung over him like a shadow, pushing him forward even when all he wanted to do was collapse under the weight of his grief. He couldn't let her down. No matter how broken he felt, no matter how impossible the road ahead seemed, he had to find a way to fulfill her final wish. After the funeral, Lucas returned to the hospital, but things felt different now. The room seemed colder, emptier without his grandmother's presence. The silence that followed her absence was deafening, and Lucas found himself drowning in it. Grief weighed him down, but there was also something else, a sense of purpose, however faint it was. He had made a promise, and now, even if he had no idea how to keep it, he had to try. But trying wasn't easy. The days after Dona Lourdes' death were some of the darkest Lucas had ever experienced. His body, still weak from the accident, seemed like it had betrayed him. His legs, once the source of his strength and agility, now felt like dead weight. The doctors had explained his condition, a spinal injury that had damaged the nerves controlling his lower body. The words, permanent disability, had been thrown around, but they had also mentioned the possibility of some recovery with intense rehabilitation. Still, the outlook was grim. Lucas didn't care about the medical terms. All he knew was that he couldn't move his legs, and without them, he couldn't play football. And without football, what was the point? His entire life had been centered around the sport. It was his identity, his future, the one thing he was good at. Now it was gone. The physical therapy sessions started almost immediately, though Lucas didn't have the heart for them. The therapists were kind but firm, urging him to push through the pain, to keep moving. "You have to try," they would say, their voices encouraging. "Every step forward is progress." But Lucas didn't feel like he was making progress. Every time he tried to move his legs, every time he attempted to stand, the frustration boiled over. His body wouldn't listen to him, and it felt like the harder he tried, the more impossible the task became. He would sit there, staring at his lifeless legs, wishing he could will them into action, but they remained still, mocking him. More than once, Lucas found himself wanting to give up. What was the point of all this? The pain, the struggle. For what? He'd never play professionally again. The dream he had worked so hard for was dead, and no amount of therapy was going to bring it back. It was during one of these moments, sitting in the hospital's rehabilitation center, that Lucas overheard a conversation that would change everything. Two patients were talking nearby, both of them in wheelchairs. One of them, a man in his mid-30s, was telling the other about a Paralympic basketball league he'd joined after his own accident. "It saved me," the man said, his voice calm but full of conviction. "I thought my life was over after the accident, but then I found this team. Playing again, competing, it gave me a purpose. It made me feel alive." Lucas didn't mean to listen in, but he couldn't help it. His ears perked up at the mention of sports. He turned slightly in his chair, trying to hear more. The man continued, "It's not the same as before, sure, but it's still a way to compete, to be part of something bigger than yourself. You should look into it. You'd be surprised how much it helps." Lucas sat there, thinking. A Paralympic sport? The idea had never even crossed his mind. He had been so focused on what he had lost that he hadn't considered the possibility of doing something new. It wasn't football, but it was still sports. It was still competition. Maybe, just maybe, it was a way forward. That night, Lucas couldn't stop thinking about what he had overheard. Could he really get back into sports, even like this? Could he honor his grandmother's wish in a different way than he had planned? The next morning, during his physical therapy session, Lucas asked his therapist about Paralympic sports. Her face lit up immediately. "That's a great idea, Lucas," she said, her enthusiasm palpable. "There are so many options. Wheelchair basketball, swimming, even track and field events for athletes with disabilities. I can connect you with someone who can help get you started." Lucas wasn't sure what he expected, but her excitement gave him a small flicker of hope. Maybe this was the way to fulfill his promise after all. Maybe this was the path he was supposed to take. The next few days were different. For the first time since the accident, Lucas approached his therapy sessions with a bit more energy. He still struggled, and his progress was slow, but now there was a reason to keep going. Paralympic sports might be his new future, and if he could succeed there, he could still lift a trophy for himself, for his grandmother. Soon enough, Lucas was introduced to a local Paralympic coach, a man named Marco, who had been a competitive swimmer before an accident had taken away the use of his legs. Now he coached athletes who had gone through similar experiences, helping them find their strength again. Marco was tough but encouraging. "You've got potential, Lucas," he said after their first meeting. "I know you're used to football, but there's a whole world of Paralympic sports out there. We'll find the right fit for you." For the first time in a long while, Lucas felt something stir inside him. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there. Maybe his journey wasn't over yet. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to keep his promise. Lucas didn't know what to expect when he first showed up at the Paralympic Training Center. It felt strange, almost like he was stepping into a new world, far removed from the familiar fields of grass and dirt he had spent his whole life playing on. The air here was different, filled with the quiet hum of determination. Athletes of all shapes, sizes, and abilities were scattered throughout the facility, each focused on their own training. Some were in wheelchairs, others on prosthetic legs, but all of them had the same intensity in their eyes, the same fire Lucas had once felt inside himself. Marco greeted him at the door, giving Lucas a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Welcome to the team, Lucas," he said. "I know this feels different, but give it time. You'll find your place here." For the first few weeks, everything was about learning. Lucas had to get used to his new body, how it moved, how it didn't move, and how to work with the equipment that would become an extension of himself. Marco suggested that Lucas try a variety of sports: wheelchair basketball, hand cycling, and even wheelchair rugby. Each one was a new challenge, testing his strength, his coordination, and most of all, his patience. At first, Lucas struggled. Everything felt awkward. His arms were constantly sore from pushing the wheelchair, and his competitive spirit kept clashing with his limitations. He had always been fast, agile, able to outmaneuver his opponents with ease. But now he felt slow, clumsy, and out of place. Every missed shot, every failed pass gnawed at him, reminding him of what he had lost. But Marco was patient, always pushing him to keep going. "It's not about how fast you get there," he would say. "It's about showing up, doing the work, and getting better each day." The other athletes at the center were supportive too. They knew exactly what Lucas was going through because they had all been there themselves. There was a sense of camaraderie here that Lucas hadn't expected. They didn't see him as someone who had lost something. They saw him as a fellow competitor, someone who was fighting his own battle to get back in the game. As the weeks turned into months, Lucas started to improve. His body adapted to the new challenges, and his mind began to shift as well. The frustration was still there, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it fueled him. He started waking up each morning with a new sense of purpose, not just to train, but to push himself, to see how far he could go. One day, after an intense wheelchair basketball practice, Marco pulled him aside. "You're making great progress, Lucas. I can see the fire coming back," he said, a proud smile on his face. Lucas wiped the sweat from his brow, still catching his breath. "It feels good," he admitted. "Better than I thought it would." "I think it's time we talk about competition," Marco continued, his tone serious. "There's a regional Paralympic event coming up in a few months. I think you should enter. You've got the skills, and more importantly, you've got the mindset." The thought of competing again sent a jolt of excitement through Lucas. It had been so long since he'd felt that rush, that nervous energy before a big game. But then doubt crept in, like a shadow following closely behind. "Do you really think I'm ready?" he asked, unsure. Marco didn't hesitate. "I know you're ready. You've worked hard, and you've got the heart for it. This is your chance, Lucas. Your chance to show everyone, including yourself, what you're capable of." Lucas knew what this meant. It wasn't just about the competition. It was about the promise he had made to his grandmother. The idea of lifting a trophy, of honoring her memory, had kept him going through the toughest days of his recovery. And now, here was a real opportunity to make that dream a reality. The next few months were the hardest Lucas had ever trained. Every session was grueling, pushing his body to its limits and beyond. But there was something different now. The pain and exhaustion weren't obstacles. They were part of the process. Each time his muscles screamed in protest, he pushed harder, knowing that the end goal was within reach. The athletes at the center became like a second family to him. They cheered each other on, celebrated each small victory, and shared the burden of setbacks. For the first time since the accident, Lucas didn't feel alone in his journey. He had a team again. People who understood the struggle, who knew what it was like to fight for something that seemed impossible. And through it all, Lucas held on to the memory of his grandmother's words. "Promise me you won't give up." He repeated that promise to himself every day, using it as a mantra to keep pushing forward. Every drop of sweat, every aching muscle, every second of doubt was a step closer to fulfilling that promise. By the time the regional Paralympic event arrived, Lucas felt like a different person. He wasn't the same kid who had stepped onto the football field all those months ago, dreaming of professional glory. He was stronger now, both physically and mentally, and more determined than ever to make his grandmother proud. Marco was right. Lucas was ready. The days leading up to the competition were a whirlwind of activity and preparation. Lucas had never felt more focused, more in tune with his body and his goals. The routine that had once seemed daunting, early mornings, grueling workouts, endless drills, now felt like second nature. Every session with Marco was another step towards something greater, something Lucas could feel but couldn't yet fully see. But with that focus came the familiar jitters, the pressure that always built up before a big event. Only this time, it was different. Lucas wasn't just competing for a win. He was competing to fulfill a promise he had made to the most important person in his life. That weight felt heavier than any physical training he had done in the past few months. Marco could sense Lucas's nerves creeping in during their final week of practice. One afternoon, after a particularly tough session, he pulled Lucas aside. "You're ready, Lucas," he said firmly, looking him square in the eye. "You've put in the work, and I've seen you grow more than you realize. Trust yourself. Don't let the pressure get into your head." Lucas nodded, but the knot in his stomach remained. Trust yourself. It was easier said than done. What if he failed? What if he let everyone down? What if, after all this time, he couldn't live up to the promise he had made? "Look," Marco continued, softening his tone, "I know this is about more than just the race for you. I know you're carrying a lot on your shoulders right now. But you've already made your grandmother proud, Lucas. Just by getting here, everything else is a bonus." Those words struck Lucas harder than he expected. He had been so consumed by the need to win, to lift that trophy for his grandmother, that he hadn't stopped to think about the journey itself. The long hours of training, the struggles, the triumphs, all of it had been part of the promise. Just being here, ready to compete, was a victory in itself. Still, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was about more than just him. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, as clear as if she were standing next to him. "Promise me you won't give up." She had always believed in him, even when he didn't, and that belief was what had carried him this far. The night before the competition, Lucas sat alone in his room, his racing wheelchair propped against the wall, his uniform laid out on the bed. The house was quiet, but his thoughts were anything but. He thought about the accident, about those first few days in the hospital when he thought his life was over. He thought about the moment his grandmother made him promise to keep fighting, and how that promise had been his anchor when everything else felt like it was slipping away. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow was the day he would put everything on the line, not just for himself, but for her. No matter the outcome, he knew he had already done something remarkable. He had found a way to keep going, even when he thought he couldn't. The morning of the competition dawned crisp and clear. The air was cool, with just enough bite to keep Lucas alert, but not cold enough to stiffen his muscles. The event was being held at a large sports complex, bustling with athletes, coaches, and spectators. As Lucas wheeled into the venue, the noise and energy of the place washed over him, a mix of excitement and nerves building up in his chest. He met Marco near the starting line, his coach giving him one final nod of encouragement. "This is it," Marco said, his voice steady. "Just remember what we've worked on. Stay focused. Stay calm. You've got this." Lucas nodded, tightening his grip on the wheels of his chair. His heart was pounding, but there was a strange sense of calm beneath the nerves. He had trained for this. He was ready, and no matter what happened today, he knew he was fulfilling his grandmother's wish just by being here. As he lined up at the starting line, surrounded by other athletes, Lucas took one last deep breath. The world seemed to slow down for a moment, the noise fading into the background. It was just him and the track now, him and the promise he had made. The starting gun fired, and Lucas surged forward, his arms pumping with every ounce of strength he had. This was it, the moment he had been working toward, the moment he had promised her he would reach. The moment the gun fired, everything else faded away. It was just Lucas and the track. His muscles burned as he pushed the wheels of his chair with all the strength he could muster, his arms moving in a steady, powerful rhythm. The crowd's cheers became a distant hum in the back of his mind. He had trained for this. Every grueling session, every setback, every ounce of doubt, it all led to this moment. The race was intense from the start. Athletes surged forward, their wheelchairs speeding down the track at a breakneck pace. Lucas could feel the strain in his arms, but he had learned to push past the pain. His body had been through worse. He kept his focus, his eyes locked on the track ahead, measuring every turn, every push of the wheels. As the race progressed, Lucas found himself slipping into a rhythm, his training kicking in automatically. Marco's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him to stay calm, to pace himself. "Don't rush it. Let the race come to you," Marco had always said, and that's what Lucas did. He let the race unfold, his movements smooth and controlled. But there was a moment halfway through when doubt crept in. The competitors around him were fierce, their chairs flying down the lanes. For a split second, Lucas wondered if he could really do this, if all the work, all the pain would be enough. The familiar fear of failure tried to claw its way back into his mind. That's when he thought of her, his grandmother. "Promise me you won't give up." The words hit him like a jolt of electricity. His arms surged with new strength, his body pushing harder than it had all race. He wasn't just racing for himself. He was racing for her, for everything she had done for him, for every sacrifice she had made. This wasn't just a race. It was the fulfillment of a promise. As the final lap approached, Lucas felt a surge of energy. His arms moved faster, his body leaning forward as he picked up speed. The athletes around him were just as determined, but Lucas had something else pushing him forward, something stronger than competition, stronger than pain. The finish line was in sight now, just a few hundred meters away. The crowd's cheers grew louder, the energy in the stadium electrifying. Lucas could feel his heart pounding, his breath coming in quick, sharp bursts, but he didn't let up. His grandmother's face flashed in his mind, her smile, her unwavering belief in him, her voice telling him he could do anything if he just kept pushing. With one final burst of strength, Lucas powered forward. His arms ached, every muscle in his body screaming for relief, but he didn't stop. Not now, not when he was so close. And then, it happened. He crossed the finish line. For a split second, there was nothing but silence in Lucas's mind. The world seemed to stop. He couldn't quite process what had just happened. All he knew was that he had crossed the line. He had finished the race. Then the cheers hit him. The crowd roared, the noise washing over him like a wave. Lucas sat back in his chair, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The realization slowly started to sink in. He had done it. He had won. Tears welled up in his eyes as the weight of the moment crashed over him. He looked down at his hands, still gripping the wheels of his chair, and then up at the crowd. Somewhere in that sea of faces, he imagined his grandmother watching him with pride. Marco was the first to reach him, clapping him on the back with a wide grin. "You did it, Lucas!" he shouted over the noise. "You won!" But it wasn't just the victory that mattered to Lucas. It was what it meant. He had kept his promise. He had found a way to lift that trophy, just like he had told his grandmother he would. The trophy wasn't just a symbol of his triumph on the track. It was a symbol of everything he had overcome. The accident, the loss, the doubt. All of it had led him here. As the officials brought out the medal and trophy, Lucas felt the tears finally spill over. He didn't care about holding them back anymore. This was the moment he had been working toward, the moment his grandmother had always believed would come. And now, it was here. When they placed the gold medal around his neck, Lucas felt a surge of emotion unlike anything he had ever felt before. He lifted the trophy high above his head, the crowd erupting into applause and cheers. But in his heart, he wasn't holding that trophy just for them. He was holding it for her. "This is for you, Vo," he whispered under his breath, his voice choked with emotion. "I kept my promise." The moment was bittersweet. He had won, yes, but the person he most wanted to share it with was gone. Still, he knew she was there, in spirit, watching over him. Lucas could almost feel her presence beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her smile bright and full of pride. For the first time since the accident, Lucas felt a sense of peace. He had done what he thought was impossible. He had rebuilt his life, his dream, and found a new purpose. The road hadn't been easy, and it had taken everything he had, but in the end, he had made it. As the cheers died down and the crowd began to disperse, Lucas sat in his chair, holding the trophy close to his chest. He didn't need words to express what he was feeling. He knew that this victory wasn't just his. It belonged to his grandmother too. She had been with him every step of the way, guiding him, believing in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. And now, as he sat there, basking in the glow of his victory, Lucas knew that no matter what challenges came next, he would face them head on, because he had already learned the most important lesson, to never give up, no matter how impossible things seemed. He had promised, and he had kept that promise. The victory had been sweet, but as the days passed, Lucas realized it wasn't the trophy that mattered most. It wasn't the medal around his neck or the cheers from the crowd that stayed with him. What lingered was the journey, the road he had taken to get here, the promise he had made, and the quiet strength he had found within himself when everything seemed lost. In the days after the competition, Lucas felt a strange sense of calm. For so long, his life had been driven by the need to prove something, to himself, to others, and to his grandmother. Now, having crossed that finish line, he understood that the real victory had come long before he lifted the trophy. It had come in the moments when he chose to keep going, even when giving up seemed easier. He thought often of his grandmother in those quiet moments, her voice, her laugh, the way she had always believed in him. And now, even though she wasn't physically there, he could feel her presence everywhere, in the sunlight, filtering through his window in the mornings, in the encouraging words of his teammates, in the newfound sense of purpose that filled his days. The competition had been just the beginning. Lucas knew that now. The track had given him back a piece of himself that he thought he had lost after the accident. It had reignited the fire within him, but more importantly, it had shown him that life wasn't just about football or trophies. It was about resilience, about finding strength in the face of adversity, and about the people who stood by you when times were tough. Marco had been right all along. Lucas had already made his grandmother proud simply by getting back up, by fighting for something even when it seemed impossible. And now, as Lucas looked ahead, he saw a future full of possibilities, not just for himself, but for others too. It didn't take long for word of his victory to spread. People in his community started reaching out. Old teammates, former coaches, even strangers who had heard about his story. They wanted to know how he had done it, how he had managed to come back from such a devastating injury to become a champion. At first, Lucas didn't know what to say. It hadn't been easy, and there hadn't been a clear path forward. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, he realized that it was the support of the people around him, the belief of his grandmother, and his own refusal to give up that had carried him through. As the weeks passed, Lucas found himself stepping into a new role, that of a mentor. Athletes who were going through their own struggles, some facing disabilities, others dealing with personal challenges, came to him for advice and encouragement. Lucas never saw himself as a leader before, but now he understood that his journey had given him something valuable to offer others. He started visiting rehabilitation centers, speaking to young athletes who, like him, had seen their dreams shattered by accidents or illnesses. At first, he wasn't sure what to say, how to connect. But as soon as he shared his story, the raw, unfiltered truth of his struggles, he saw the impact it had. People listened. They saw in him the proof that it was possible to rebuild, to find a new path, even when the old one had been destroyed. One afternoon, after speaking to a group of young athletes, a boy in a wheelchair rolled up to Lucas. He couldn't have been older than 16, his face pale and full of uncertainty. "Do you really think I can get back into sports?" the boy asked, his voice small but full of hope. Lucas knelt down to his level, looking him square in the eye. "I don't just think you can," Lucas said, a soft smile on his face. "I know you can. It's not going to be easy, but if you want it, and if you're willing to fight for it, you'll find a way, just like I did." The boy smiled back, a glimmer of determination sparking in his eyes. Lucas recognized that look. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror all those months ago when he had first started his own journey back to the track. As Lucas left the rehabilitation center that day, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. His own victory had been meaningful, yes, but helping others find their way, that was something deeper. His grandmother had always believed in giving back, in lifting others up, and now Lucas knew this was his way of honoring her legacy. In the months that followed, Lucas continued to compete, but now his focus wasn't solely on winning. He had found a balance between his personal goals and his desire to inspire others. The two things fed each other, driving him to be the best version of himself, not just for his own sake, but for the people who were looking to him for guidance. Every time he rolled onto the track, he still felt that surge of adrenaline, that fierce competitive spirit. But now, there was a deeper sense of purpose behind it. He wasn't just racing for himself anymore. He was racing for everyone who had ever been told they couldn't do something, for everyone who had ever felt like giving up. And in those quiet moments before a race, when the world slowed down and his heart started pounding in his chest, Lucas would close his eyes and picture his grandmother's face, her smile, her warmth, the love that had guided him through the darkest times. He had kept his promise. But more than that, he had found his own way, a way to honor her, a way to build a new life, and a way to give back to the people who needed it most.